everyone, welcome to the second part of my journey of making a pair of 18th century stays. In this video I will be showing you exactly how I made the finished pair of stays. Right here I already cut out my separate pattern pieces out of the fabric and I'm now basting the layers together. The fabric I'm using are a jacquard silk for the top layer, a tightly woven cotton similar to coutil for the in-between layer, and a layer of linen for the back. Silk, cotton and linen were all very common materials for making stays at the time. I should also mention that I'm basting the layers together so the fabric doesn't move too much when I'm drawing and stitching the boning channels. I always do this when I make a corset out of multiple layers of fabric. After basting all of the layers together, it was once again time to stitch down all of the boning channels. I marked the boning channels with a pink disappearing ink pen. This worked really well. This time I also made sure to check the width of the channels to be sure the boning would fit properly inside, since this was a big issue I had when I was making the mock-up. You can also see that I'm not cutting off the thread ends here. I was planning on threading the ends through a needle and using them to close off the boning channels. I saw Morgan Donner do this in her stays video, but the thread ends were annoying me so badly I cut them off anyway and decided to whip stitch around the edges to close off the channels instead. Next up, it was time to stitch back the seam allowance on all of the pieces. This felt very unnatural to me, since the seam allowance is usually the place where you stitch with your sewing machine, but on pictures of the inside of Stays, as well as the Marie Antoinette episode of A Stitch in Time, this is the way it seemed to be done. I used a simple whip stitch and 2 strands of extra strong thread for this. Which worked really well. Once I had all of the seam allowances stitched back, it was time for me to stitch the actual pieces together. I have been quite busy with stitching the stays together. I was originally planning on using the stitch that I also used while I was stitching my mock-up together, but I found out that with all of the extra fabric that the final version has, and with the seam allowance stitched down, which I obviously didn't have when I was making the mock-up, this stitch is a lot less strong than I would want it to be. I can't show it with one hand, but you can see a lot of holes in between, as you can tell right here. And in the Marie Antoinette episode of A Stitch in Time, the seamstress did say that that was normal, but when I pull them apart, I feel like the thread is going to rip, even though I used extra strong thread and used 4 strands of it, as you can see. And I don't like that because I don't want them to rip. So I took a look at more stays from the time and the insides. I have a special Pinterest board for the inside of historical garments, and it seems like they used this stitch together with just a normal looping stitch. I don't know what it's called right now. So I'm not too sure how they did that. I couldn't really find it on the internet, but most people I saw or who I came across who also made stays just used this method of just going around and around and around. So that is what I did on this side, and this is so much stronger. It doesn't look very pretty, but this is the inside anyway, so I don't care, and the lining is going to be covering this. But it has a lot less holes. This one still has some, but this one doesn't have any at all. So this was my first row, this was my second and my third, so it keeps getting better. So I think I'm also going to go along this one again and just go around like I did with these to give it some extra strength, because I don't like how floppy this is and how much room there is in between. I don't want them to rip or fall apart. So that's what I'm doing right now. I am making my own bias tape to use for the binding. For this project I used a regular thin cotton for the binding. I know leather binding was often used for binding stays, but I couldn't find a nice leather or leather bias tape to match with the colors of my stays, so I decided to use cotton instead, which was pretty common as well. Leather was preferred though because it protected the stays better. I make my own bias binding by taking one edge of the fabric and laying it on the selvage edge of the other side. This is how you find the bias of the fabric. I usually cut this piece off and start measuring how long my tapes need to be. I do this by simply measuring the edge I need to bind. I got a set of bias tape makers and used my iron and some water to press the tapes into the right shape. I ended up rebinding the first part of the tabs a couple of times. I started off with 1.8 cm bias tapes, but these were way too wide and I couldn't get them around the edges without too many folds and bumps. When I expressed my frustration on my Instagram story, one of my followers suggested that I make smaller tapes. So I went ahead and made 1.2 cm tapes instead of 1.8, and this worked so well. Because the binding was much smaller, I could move them around the curves of the tabs much better, and in the end I managed to get them on tightly enough so that they wouldn't bother me anymore. I did the binding for these stays in a different way than I usually do. Normally I just stitch straight on the inside of the bias tape on the top of the fabric, like binding is usually attached. But when I did it this way, I couldn't get the binding neatly around the edges, so I decided to top stitch all of the binding in the same way you would usually attach the binding to the back of a corset, by picking up a single fabric thread and keeping the needle as flat as possible once you move it back up into the binding. I finally finished binding all of my stay pieces, which honestly took way longer than I was expecting. I actually ended up rebinding the bottom tabs 3 times when I was trying it for the first time, twice with bigger bias tape, and it just wasn't working out. It was getting really wrinkled and it didn't look good at all. So someone on my Instagram told me that I should make smaller binding strips. So that's what I did, and that worked so well. There are still a couple like little places where it's not perfectly tied, but it looks good enough to me, and I'm very happy with how it turned out. I was also very scared that the binding fabric wouldn't match the actual fabric of these stays, because the stays are more of a pink shade and the binding is more of a like lilac purple shade. But I think that in the end it all goes together really well. And as you can also see, I added all of the decorative strips to all of the seam lines that were visible. And yeah, I'm really happy with how it turned out. Now I'm going to start putting the lining together for the back pieces, because obviously they still look very ugly. Online I read that stays were often lined with a soft cotton, so I will be using the same cotton fabric that I used for making my binding for the lining on the inside, and hopefully that will work out. And I'll check back in with you later. Making and attaching the lining was pretty straightforward. In the end, I chose to save time and stitch the pieces of the lining together by machine as well. I made sure to match up the seams of the lining to the seams of the stays and pinned the seam allowance to the inside. To stitch down the lining, I used the same small stitches I also used for attaching my binding. I also wasn't sure if I had to attach the lining first and then add the binding, or the other way around, but all of the 18th century stays I looked at seemed to have the lining on top of the binding, so that's what I decided to do as well. The last thing I had to do before the stays were completely finished was stitching the eyelets. I used an awl to make the eyelet holes, as it was done historically as well. Then I got 3 strands of embroidery thread that matched my fabric and started hand stitching the eyelets. The way I do this is pretty simple. I just stick the needle through the hole from the wrong side to the right side and stick it back into the fabric about 5 mm away from the eyelet hole. This was also my first time using an awl to make eyelet holes, and I noticed that I had to reopen the hole properly a couple times. I don't know if other people experienced the same when using an awl, but this worked pretty well for me, and in the end I had really pretty eyelets. And with that, my 18th century stays are finished. I am so happy with how these turned out, especially for my first ever pair of stays. Making these was a long process, but I also had a lot of fun and I learned so much and got way better at hand stitching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, because more sewing videos will be coming in the near future.